In stories, justice usually arrives at the end. Questions are answered, responsibility is assigned. The uncertainty that carried the story forward finally settles. But history does not always work that way. Sometimes the ending never arrives. And in Whitechapel, it never did. I'm Jenny. I love history and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. In this series, I explore crime through context rather than spectacle, asking not just what happened, but what kind of world made it possible. The man known as Jack the Ripper was never identified with any certainty. Over the years, many names have been proposed. Doctors, butchers, immigrants, locals. Each theory reflects something about the time in which it was created. Some explanations look for medical expertise. Others search for outsiders. Some imagine intelligence and calculation. Others imagine chaos. But certainty has remained just out of reach. And so the story continued. Books were written, theories multiplied. Investigations were reopened decades after the streets themselves had moved on. With each new generation, the question returned, who was he? The absence of an answer made the mystery more powerful. Because uncertainty has a strange effect on the human imagination. It refuses to stay quiet. When violence remains unsolved, it rarely disappears. Instead, it evolves. The events themselves slowly fade into the past, but the figure at the centre of the story grows larger. The unknown becomes fascinating. The mystery becomes a puzzle waiting to be solved. And over time, the story risks changing shape. The question becomes less about the people who were lost and more about the person who was never found. But the women whose deaths shaped this story were not symbols. They were individuals living within the fragile conditions of Whitechapel. Their lives were shaped by poverty, by unstable work, by overcrowded housing, by the daily calculations required to survive. Understanding that context does not solve the mystery, but it does change the way we see it. Violence rarely appears in isolation. It emerges from environments, from systems, from conditions that shape vulnerability long before anyone recognizes them. The man known as Jack the Ripper may never be identified, but the world that allowed him to move through Whitechapel, that world is not a mystery. It is visible in the overcrowded streets, in the instability of work, in the social indifference that allowed suffering to remain ordinary. History does not always provide answers. Sometimes it leaves us with questions that cannot be resolved. But these questions can still teach us something. Not about a single figure hiding in the shadows, lurking and hoping that nobody will spot them, but about the conditions that allowed him to remain unseen. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Whitechapel and what happened there. This mystery continues to capture attention, but the conditions that shaped it deserve just as much scrutiny. Because history rarely leaves behind only a villain. History also leaves behind the victims, who, unless we tell their stories, will not be remembered. History also leaves behind a world that then needs to live with what has happened. Thank you for listening to Season 1 of The Hidden Conditions. Until next time, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind. I'm looking forward to sharing Season 2 with you soon.